Welcome. We're really glad to see you here. We've designed this presentation with Rotary International in mind, and we're just great to see you all here. I am Ernest Thiessen, president of Smartsettle. Our vision is to help resolve conflict in a more peaceful, collaborative, and intelligent way. I am credited with inventing the world's first practical multi-party collaboration system, complete with 8 sophisticated algorithms that give the Smartsettle neutral site its intelligence. But this technology would be nothing without the smart people around me. There have been many that have contributed along the way, and 2 of those sharp people are here today to help me with the presentation. Peter, our Chief Product Development Officer, will introduce the case study, and Carissa, our top facilitator, will lead us through the simulation. The case study today, called Fraser River, will include a simulation using Smartsettle Infinity. Our objective is to demonstrate a collaboration process and have you imagine how this same process could bring tremendous benefits to any number of peacemaking projects that Rotary is involved in, including the most important negotiation problems on Earth. Think about high conflict situations and imagine how that situation could be different with an early intervention tool like we're going to show you today. We'd love to hear what you think, and if you have questions, please pop them into the chat. We might answer them along the way or save them till the end. Over to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Ernie. Well, as you just heard, Smartsettle Infinity is the brainchild of Dr. Ernie Thiessen, who began thinking about better methods for peacemaking when he was working in Nepal. The theoretical work arose when Thiessen was working for his PhD in Cornell University, and he chose to tackle the challenge put to him by his major advisor. So that brings us to today's case, which we call Fraser River, and is presented in 2 parts. The first part is an introduction to the scenario itself and an overview of the Smartsettle Infinity process. The second part is an actual simulation of a case study using contrived but quite realistic values. Well, first of all, our case study is between 3 parties. And the example today is between the Fraser River First Nation, First Nations being Indigenous people here in Canada, the province of British Columbia, and Chile City. While this is generally based on Chilliwack, BC, hence Chile City, and a 2016 report on the adequacy of dykes protecting the area, we'd like to emphasize that this is fictional representation and any similarities to actual people or places is purely coincidental. Well, as fate would have it, the core presentation predates the recent flooding events by 5 years, but it was inspired by a 2016 report that highlighted the need to upgrade the region's dykes, in fact, to upgrade all the region's dykes. And as many of you are already aware, the system of dykes and pumping stations proved inadequate, as this image will show you, and to prevent the recent storm events that actually flooded the area. And to give you an idea of the enormity of that, the estimated cost of the flood is in excess of $1 billion. There's just less than 1,000 cattle being lost, and way over 500,000 chickens in the hen houses, the large farms on the prairie. This flood, which you just saw in that image, is actually caused by a river, the Nooksack River, flowing north from the USA over the border. And as you can see in the image on the right in the circle, the Nooksack River there is the bottom left. It's quite a large river, nowhere near as large as the Fraser itself, but that is really quite flat terrain. And when it overflows its banks, it flows north and into what is the drained lake bottom, which is the image you saw earlier. It has been noted that negotiating a solution that spans international border is especially challenging, and we'd love that challenge if it came our way. So on to our scenario. The recent floods are a fall problem associated with heavy local rainfall, and the case study we'll be presenting focuses on upgrading the dykes protecting the low-lying areas from the 1,375 kilometre long Fraser River as it flows into its delta lands. The major Fraser River threat is during the spring, when a combination of precipitation and snowmelt across the whole length of the river raises the river level considerably. This image you see is actually the aerial view of the Fraser River with the city of Chilliwack on the right. The BC government has fundamentally agreed to pay for most of the dike upgrades if the city and the First Nations can agree on the priorities of how they will actually share in the costs. So here's a representation. As you can see, there's a certain sort of, they look somewhat similar. The First Nation lands have been moved, by the way, and things like that. So this representation, try and keep it in your head. Dike A there primarily protects the Chile City region. Dike B, which is the yellow dike, primarily, well, it impacts both the Fraser River First Nation to the north and also Chile City to the south. And Dike C is really primarily, it impacts only the Fraser River First Nation itself. And you'll notice a little cross on the top left there behind dots, and that represents an upgrade to this dike. And if that upgrade can include that dotted line, then the First Nations have their heritage site and graveyards protected, which they're quite keen to do. The green square in the middle is the essentially a barrage pumping station, and that's an option that we're going to talk about. And if that barrage is put in there, protecting the lands which are currently protected by Dike B, it won't be necessary to raise the dike, but it does cause a problem for a fish hatchery H1 because the fish can't get past the barrage unless you build a fairly expensive fish ladder. So try and just keep that image in your mind, and that will help you, I think, when you think of Dike A, Dike B, Dike C, and the barrage pumping station. Now the process begins with a modelling phase. The objective is for each stakeholder to develop and to bring all their issues to the table and gain a deep understanding of their own preferred outcomes. In other words, it's entirely what they want. They don't have to think about the other people. They're bringing their issues to the table. When they do that, they can actually interact with the other parties, and they may work with them to ensure that they have identified all the issues and to make sure everything's there and everyone can see what is there. No negotiation takes place at this phase, but a range by which the settlement is likely to finally occur is defined, and defining the issues in the negotiating ranges gives us the wherewithal to, in actual fact, put in a single negotiating framework. And that builds a single negotiating framework, which is a draft agreement that has blanks within it. And those blanks are going to be filled in when we actually come to a settlement. Now, the model for this framework information is what goes into Infinity. And we're going to show you in this presentation the solution phase. We have all the issues already resolved, sorry, not resolved, we have all the issues out there that we can actually consider. And at that point, each party will go through a process that Chris is going to take you through, building the packages and exchanging proposals, and something along the lines of you'll be familiar with negotiating generally. So moving on to the next slide here, this is a very illustrative draft agreement, single negotiating framework, as we call them. And it's a statement that just think of it as the final agreement document, which can be printed out as a PDF. The dikes need upgrading. That's just a little overview of what it is. And therefore, and there's a whole list of things that the parties will agree to, which in the draft of the single negotiating framework is blanks at this stage, but it will show what the range is. There's no need for the parties to get into any arguments or adversarial behavior. They just have to state what they prefer and what the lowest or the earliest that phase one shall proceed. Somebody said it is 18 months. They all would be happy if they started 18 months. Sorry, not all. One will be happy with 18 months start, another wants to delay till 60 months, 5 years time. So that's the range we deal with. We've then put in a couple of tables a list of other issues that need to be agreed in this, and you'll see these tables now coming up. The first one, not surprisingly, is the the one I just explained. What's the agreed start time? And then what are the funding percentages? And if you can memorize, which I'm sure you haven't quite, the dykes that I just showed you on the image. Dyke A really only affects Chile City, and BC, the province of BC, which is going to be providing certainly the majority of the funding, wants to negotiate with Chile City how much they are actually going to fund. And so the range is between Chile City funding 0 and BC funding 100%. And Chile City is going to decide how much it funds. Obviously, if it funds 20%, BC will only need to find the other 80. And then going down, Dyke C, it just affects the First Nation and the province. But Dyke B is a lot more complicated because it affects 2 of the parties. So all 3 parties are involved in that. And there's also the barrage pumping station. And there are also a few issues to do with the fish ladder. So going to the next table, which it also illustrates some of the things, you'll notice now we're dealing with options. It's not just a number. And these options are worked out by the parties when they actually building the single negotiating framework and putting the issues on the table. And if I just take Dyke B there, you'll see there are 7 options there. There could be many more than 7 options in a real negotiation, but this one includes the barrage, what phase it's going to be in, whether there's going to be a fish ladder. So that's the example we just showed there. So moving on again, there are also behind the scenes some shared constraints. This one is a very straightforward one, whereby we want to make sure that when the parties have agreed on what percentage they're going to pay, it's always going to come to 100%. And so this is in the background just to make sure that happens. There are other constraints that you might have also understood from just looking at that. One would be, if we build the barrage pumping station, then we do not need to negotiate an upgrade to that particular dike. So that would also be built in. Right, well, at this stage, I'm handing over to Carissa, who's going to take you through the simulation and just give you a lot more of a feel of what that solution phase is and what we're doing. All right, Carissa, so over to you, and I will be still on the slides. I will click you through, so if you just want to tell me when you want to move ahead, I'll do as I'm told.
Sounds good. Thank you, Peter. That was a thorough introduction to the scenario, and we appreciate that. Okay, so Smartsettle Infinity, our goal is to try and create beyond win-win solutions. And this graph is an illustration of the process that we can take parties through with Smartsettle Infinity. So the first thing we do is graph the satisfactions of all of the parties. So the BC government is here too, but it's difficult to show a graph with all 3 parties on it, but I'll show you on the next slide how you can imagine that. So you can see here that Chile City is 100% satisfied at the top left of the screen, and First Nations is 100% satisfied at the bottom right. So now we have a graph that shows that we can create benefits for both parties. So it's a win-win solution. It's not win-lose. We can find a solution that at the same time provides benefits to both parties. So our goal is to find a solution that is on the efficiency frontier. So the first thing that we're going to ask parties to do is to map out the minimum satisfaction for each of them. So you can give us a click there, Peter, and then it'll show that. Okay, so now we have the minimum satisfaction mapped out for each party, and that creates a zone of possible agreement. In the top right side here, we can find solutions that are satisfactory to both parties. So the next thing that we're going to ask parties to do is to exchange optimistic proposals with each other. So by optimistic proposal, what we say for that is create a proposal that you're willing to concede from. And we share that information with both sides. that willingness to concede. This promotes a feeling of collaboration and an understanding that we are working together to resolve this negotiation. So you can see here that even though each of these optimistic proposals fall below the minimum satisfaction of the other side, we both or all still understand that this is just the beginning and we're working together to solve this negotiation and find a solution that's actually in that zone of possible agreement. So the next thing that we do is we ask Smartsettle Infinity to generate suggestions. By this point, we've actually input the preferences of the parties on all the possible issues into the Smartsettle Infinity tool. Infinity understands these preferences and then is able to provide possible solutions that are semi-optimal. And so Infinity negotiations happen in sessions. And in each session, parties are asked to accept any packages that are agreeable to them. I should say that each of these stars represents a package, which is a complete solution to the negotiation. So you've chosen a variable or a solution for each issue, gathered those together in a package, so it's a complete solution. So some of these suggestions will be accepted by the parties. And at the end of each session, Infinity will check to see if there are any mutually agreed packages. So a mutually agreed package will become a baseline. There it is, there's our baseline. Peter is so good here, he just really knows when to click and I haven't really had to prompt him at all. So once we have that baseline package, that's a solution that both parties are satisfied with, but we can go even farther here. We have intelligent algorithms working in the background, and our major algorithm is called Maximize the Minimum Gain. Dr. Thiessen invented this algorithm, and it will take the parties from that baseline solution to a fair and efficient solution on the efficiency frontier. And this movement can represent millions of dollars in large negotiations. So it's well worth your while to engage in this process. Okay, so now that we've showed you how this works on a graph, take us to the next slide, Peter, and then we'll remind ourselves that there's a third party here too. So with a third party, you just have to imagine that the efficiency frontier is a surface rather than just a straight line. Okay, so now that you've seen how the process works on a graph, we're going to show you the actual product and how that works. Okay, so now I think I have to stop Peter's share and share my own screen.
I was just going one more look at the actual map because it's quite useful to have that imprinted in your heads to make it clear where those dikes are.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Peter.
I'm going to stop my share now and hand it over to you, and so you can just go on to share.
Okay. Okay, so this is Smartsettle Infinity, and Peter gave us a really great overview of the scenario, and there is a lot of information there. Even with that review at the end, I'm guessing that just a small portion of that is still stuck in your heads. But Smartsettle Infinity gives you a great place to store, organize, and understand that information and keep it all in one place. So you can see here that we have our three parties, the Fraser River, Chili City, and the government of BC. And here we have our list of issues. So in a real negotiation, you may have more issues than this. But what we want to do is solve the difficult ones within Infinity. If any of the issues have, obvious solutions, we're just going to plug those ones in, and we're going to put all the difficult ones here in our negotiation. So each party has its own private graphic view. So this is a view that only Fraser River sees, and Chili City and the BC government each have their own private graphic views where they input data that's pertinent to them. Peter also showed us some constraints earlier, and constraints can either be shared by all the parties. For example, the funding that all three parties provide has to add up to 100%. So that constraint would be shared between all the parties, but there may be some private constraints as well. There are actually quite a few shared constraints in this negotiation. I'll just show you those really quick. There's a lot there, and if you're really interested in understanding all those ins and outs, you can email us and we can provide you with that information. So what you see here, we have all of the issues that are in this negotiation, and they each have a range. So we've organized this so that the best outcome for Fraser River is on the right-hand side, and the worst outcome is on the left. So then we've asked Fraser River to tell us what's important to them. And you can see here that each of these issues has a number. And these numbers represent how important those issues are to the Fraser River. So you can organize this on any scale that you like. You can start simply with, say, a scale of 1 out of 10. If the phase 1 cost is the most important issue to you, you give that a 10, and then you rank all of the other issues relative to that issue. So you can see that start time ranked at 100 points, which means it's about half as important as phase 1 cost. So now satisfaction along these issues might not be linear. So behind each of these issues is a satisfaction graph. So you can say that Fraser River is 100% satisfied up here at 0, and 0% satisfied at 24. And what we've done here is we've created a graph that in essence gives $1 million to 1 point. So you can imagine that each satisfaction point is worth $1 million. So now what we do is we add up all of these points and the total possible satisfaction from the negotiation is the total number of points. But one other thing we've done in this negotiation is we've mapped out the status quo and we've set that at 0. So the status quo is not worth 0, but here we want to be able to understand how much better we're doing. So we've set the status quo at 0, and then we go up to target, concession, and optimistic. So those are worth, for example, our target package is worth 25 million more than the current status quo. So these packages here, so a package represents a solution for the entire negotiation. And we've mapped out the status quo. So the start time is at 36, phase 1 cost 6.5, the existing for upgrade dike C, and so on and so forth. And we've created a target here, which is the green package. And this is what we are hoping to get as a kind of minimum out of this negotiation. So we're hoping to improve the current situation by about 25 million. So we'll be happy with anything that is above that point. Okay, so I should have mentioned that if you have questions as we're going, you're welcome to put those into the chat. And I think Peter will keep an eye on the chat, and then we'll answer questions as we go along. So we're going to start negotiating next. And you'll remember from the graph that we want to start with optimistic proposals. So you can see here that as an optimistic proposal, Fraser River has mostly just kept all the flags on the right-hand side, and it's quite higher than where they're trying to get in this negotiation. So this optimistic proposal is something they're willing to concede from. So I'm going to right-click and propose this package, and that's going to put it on the table up here. So this section up here called on the table is visible to all three parties. Now, I'm having the Smartsettle Infinity robot play the roles of Chile City and BC government. So they're a little faster than we are, and their proposals will already be sitting on the neutral site. So we reveal initial optimistic proposals simultaneously, and we do that via a neutral site. So when each party sends their optimistic proposal to the other parties, they will be stored on the neutral site until all three of them are there, or however many, and then they will be released at the same time to this on the table window. Now, while the values of the packages are visible to everybody, what's private is still these numbers here, because these numbers are only applicable to each party's preferences. So we can see quickly here that at -12 from the government of BC and -151 from Chile City, these solutions are going to be fairly unacceptable to Fraser River. They are below even the status quo. So now, if you remember from the graph, the next thing that we can do is ask Smartsettle to generate suggestions. And suggestions are semi-optimal solutions to the problem. Infinity is looking at all of the preferences of all three parties and then trying to find a solution that is in that zone of agreement for everybody. So, and as you can imagine, this is actually pretty hard work. So the algorithm is investigating all of the preferences of the parties along all of the issues. It's looking at the satisfaction graphs, and it's doing that for all three parties and then finding a possible solution. And I've only asked Infinity to generate one suggestion, but the Smartsettle robot might generate some suggestions for Chile City and the government of BC as well. So while we're waiting here, Infinity is not just it's not just doing all that work for one suggestion, it's doing that work for multiple suggestions.
And to give Carissa a little bit of a break, it's working on the local computer and this one, but if it was doing it for real, we'd basically have the server scaled up so it would move as quickly as we can make it move, but hopefully everyone will bear with us. The other point I think which is quite interesting to note is the way that Chris has set this up, which is the status quo is 0. So essentially anything you see on the table with it has a negative on it is beneath the status quo. You can actually normalize that and do whatever. I'll break off there because I'll leave it to Carissa so she's got her voice back, and off you go, Carissa.
Thanks, Peter. So we have got quite a number of packages to consider here. And I'm gonna accept this package 4 here. And even though it's a little bit less than our concession, just 1 point less, but it's above our target. And we're just in session 1 here, so I'm going to accept this. And as you recall, negotiations happen in sessions. So I'm going to end session 1, which will check for an agreement. So at this point, the only packages that could become a baseline solution would be 3 and 4. Because those are the only ones that I've accepted. It's important to note that these negotiations are always under the control of the parties. Infinity is never going to impose a solution on the parties. It's party controlled. So we had no deal yet, so we're going to continue negotiating in session 2.
I think I would also stress, Carissa, that package 4 there, which was accepted by the Fraser River First Nation. The other parties don't know it's accepted. It wasn't a proposal to them, which is open. It was purely a package that was accepted. But on the neutral site, it's aware that First Nations have actually accepted this.
That's right. So this yellow dot here is a private acceptance marker for the parties. while the blue dot is a public acceptance marker. And it would be fairly obvious that Fraser River would have accepted their own proposal. So that's the blue dot, and then the yellow dot is a private acceptance marker, like Peter said. So I'm going to propose our concession package next. Right click and propose. And then we'll see if we get anything back from the other two parties, and we will consider anything that comes back from them. Are there any questions in the chat yet, Peter? I should have shown the satisfaction graphs for optioned issues as well.
Yeah, there is a question actually in there. I know it's just coming through. It's from Dana Cutlow. It appears that a goal is to remove emotion from the negotiating process, but parties usually have ongoing relationships that are truly emotion laden. How do we manage that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's, I won't say that we completely remove emotion. We just try to steer the emotions in a more collaborative direction, say. And sometimes we do deal with very emotional issues within negotiations. For example, negotiations can include an apology issue, for example, and where the apology that might be made, the options for that might be a private apology, a public published apology. So there can be, and there definitely are, emotions that are incorporated into the negotiations. And this also has to do with the importances. And so a negotiation like an estate settlement would be a good example of this, where it might be much more important to a party that they have custody of the family dog, for example, rather than the car, right? And I think most people would say that well, it probably depends on the dog. You might have a show dog, but in general, the monetary value of the dog might be less than the car. I suppose it depends on the car too. These things can get very complicated. But in general, let's say that that's true, but the emotional value to the dog might be much higher than the car. And you can represent this in the negotiation so that parties in the end, we're trying our hardest to give everybody what they want. And again, going back to that graphical view, we can't get 100% for both parties, but we can almost always do better than 50-50. Okay, so we have some packages here to consider. And here it looks like package 11 is actually quite good for us. And this is interesting because package 11 from Chili City is valued at 36 points, which is really good. Whereas package 1 from Chili City came in at negative 151. And this is something that I've experienced in negotiations as well. Preferences are really important. And the initial proposals from the parties, the party receiving that proposal might take that a certain way, but because you don't know all the preferences of the other party, you can't just assume that they're not going to be able to find something that you like, right? Maybe a better way to say this is that I've seen a party make a concession, whereas to the other side, it looks like a retraction, right? And this is because we don't understand the preferences of the other party, but Infinity gives us a way to understand those really well and use those preferences to find optimal solutions.
I think to add to that is we might actually have a belief that the preferences of the other parties are totally different than they are. And this can, Carissa has done a number of real cases in this one, and I've been involved with a few. It can surprise you. You've gone in with it because we all bring in, we're prisoners of our past experience, as they say. We go in with our views of what this other person is obviously going to think, and you can be quite wrong, particularly on a couple of issues and the importance of those issues to people. And that's where this process works quite well. Well, it works very well. And going back to the Diana's question about emotion, and I think part of that emotion was people going in. I'm going to use a family separation type example of that, where there's emotion between the parties. What we try and do, and what this method does do, is it allows parties to stay in their own, I'm going to use the word bubble, we use bubbles a lot these days with COVID, but stay within their own bubble of what is important and satisfies them. They don't really have to think about the other party. They just have to focus on their needs. And that's why we're making that point.
Yeah,
there's another question here, actually, Carissa, from Jeff Aristide, who's listening.
Can I just catch everybody up first on what move I just made in here?
I apologize. Yes.
No, that's okay. That's great. So what I just did was I put our target on the table, but I put it in as a suggestion. So you saw me right click there and say suggest anonymously. And now this package, package 13, which is in fact a proposal from us, comes up looking like a suggestion. And what this does is it removes any bias that parties might have towards seeing a package that has the other party's name on it. So we've suggested that anonymously. That's on the table. I've privately accepted that. And now I'm going to end session 3 again and see if we have any mutually accepted package yet. Okay, so go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, there's another question coming in from Jeff Aristide, and it's a good question. It leads us on to something I think we're going to mention anyway. And he says, I would assume that one needs to be trained and even have some good experience as a mediator negotiator to use Infinity. And using Infinity requires parties to be engaged with Infinity's preference selections. How does the mediator explain the use of Infinity, and is there a good reception to its use by the parties? And before, Carissa, you take on that one, I'm just going to mention the fact that Infinity can be used by just one party for their own personal use. And this is a much easier situation for us, because all that is doing is that party is really investigating what's important to them, their issues, their preferences, and gives them a deep dive into how to look at the complete package, as opposed to being on a merry-go-round of wanting one issue, and then when they get another issue, they want to change what they've done in the past. So it's a great experience for that. And so we actually think that the modeler mode is a very attractive mode for people to use for their own preference in preparation for a negotiation. And if you get all the parties to do modeler mode in a selfish way, and if they all do it, then you can bring them into and offer the full negotiation. Carissa.
Mm-hmm. So getting all the parties to agree to use Infinity is a barrier. That's the answer to Jeff Aristide's question. But it's only a barrier for a certain amount of time while we're here on the frontier. For example, if you told your client that you're going to use an Excel spreadsheet to model the negotiation, they would just accept that. Yes, great, I'm sure you know what you're doing. So once Smartsettle Infinity becomes widely used and accepted, I have no doubt that it will become the standard for modeling negotiations. And whether it's being used to just model one side of the negotiation, or whether it's being used to in an interactive way, like the 3 parties are using it here, it makes negotiations much more organized, much more efficient. You've got your complete records here of the choices you were making, the preferences that you had. So it's a really neat tool to be able to use. And the other question was about training. I think there is training that's necessary. You have to understand how to input the data, but this is not hard to learn. right? So when you're creating each issue, you're entering the best and worst range, right? And it's fine to make these ranges bigger than they need to be, right? Just get an optimistic range from each party, and then during the negotiation itself, those ranges will narrow, right? So eliciting initial ranges are not hard. You just say, make it a little bigger than what you want, and no problem there. And because we all know that we're planning to concede and look for a solution together, these aren't going to antagonize or upset the other side. And it's really the facilitator's job to make sure that that process happens in that way, with that good feeling.
And just to amplify something that's, I'm sure, in people's mind, and Carissa has already certainly mentioned it, we give support to people doing Infinity, and that support is significant. And if organization uses Infinity on a regular basis, they will build expertise and will require less and less support going forward, because it does sort of unwrap itself very logically. And certainly the majority of people who are involved in these things pick it up fairly quickly. It's just a big step on a stairway, the first few steps. And after that, it's very consistent and logical how it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. Okay, so we reached a baseline. You guys probably saw this, and you remember from the graph that once we reach the baseline, we're going to apply that algorithm, maximize the minimum gain, to see if we can find something better for all the parties. Now, the real beauty of maximize the minimum gain is that when it finds an improvement, it shares that added value between all of the parties. So the improvement that we generated here, if you remember from the beginning of this negotiation, we've modeled this so that each point is worth about $1 million. So that means that this improvement here is worth 15 million more to Fraser River than package 13. And package 13 was already our target, and that's 25 million over the status quo. So we really ended up with something that's $40 million better than the status quo. And the same goes for the other parties, so Chile City and the government. And I definitely welcome you to challenge us on this, to email us and ask us for this model, to explore it more closely, because you might think, how can this possibly be? But we can do very complex modeling within Smartsettle Infinity, and it can do much more than a spreadsheet can do.
Okay, Carissa, there's another question.
Yeah, let's take questions now.
It's a great one from Richard Denton. And he says, how does one look at the root causes of a problem? This seems to be the solution, goal-orientated, but might not consider the core root causes. Thus, you'll get a solution, but not necessarily long-lasting.
Yeah, this is great. I actually had the same exact question last week, applied to an Infinity model that we are building. So you first have to solve the presenting problem, right? So, and once you solve that, you just keep working, right? Because we do want to get down to that core problem, because what we don't want is to put a Band-Aid on and then have that same thing come back up in 1 year, 2 years. I suppose it depends on the negotiation itself as well, right? Like if you can identify that core problem, and if you can present certain solutions to that problem, then by all means, let's negotiate that. Let's build that into the model, right? But the issues that you're negotiating, you can negotiate any issues that you like. So part of our process is, first of all, identifying what the issues are. And once those are identified, then the solutions to that particular issue are identified. And then we look for the solution.
Can I just jump in, Carissa? And just jump in on Richard's question. And I think it is a really useful one, and it does get to the core of some of the things that go on. If we take the example we've just done on the dikes, we're actually solving the dike problem, which is the physical problem of raising the dikes. You could argue that the root problem behind this is the failure of the budgeting process, of maintaining infrastructure. You can go behind the scenes and find a number of root causes to why money is not allocated all the time to make sure dikes don't result, or dike maintenance doesn't result in the sort of flood image that we saw earlier on at the beginning of this presentation. I don't think one can expect something like Infinity to go back all the time and solve the problem in the one case. But you could apply Infinity to the issues about infrastructure budgeting if you wanted to. It would be a different set of problems. The issues would be different. It would involve, in this particular case, probably it would involve the province of British Columbia and the government of Canada, the federal government of Canada, because funding flows through those routes, as well as how reports would be used to decide where infrastructure money should be spent. So I think it's a great question, because we've had it before, as Chris has said, and we have to look at the issues and a problem one at a time. But there's nothing to stop the Infinity being used to address any problem, and that includes root causes.
Perhaps I'll just add here one thing to the answer to Richard Denton. You know, often in these situations where there are conflicts, there's another part of the process that's really important but takes a lot longer, is transformation. So that's a well-known conflict resolution process, but Infinity assumes that the transformation part of the process, if that needs to occur, has already occurred, and you're really at the end of that process. You remember we explained earlier about creating that single negotiating framework, and all the parties are around the table and working on that. Well, that can be a long process back and forth until you get things right, and things will come up there where you can really, you know, look at what are the root causes and what do we have to work on. So there could be a long process until you get to the place where you're ready to actually negotiate the issues. You've got that single negotiating framework at a place that everybody agrees that all we need to do is negotiate these final issues. So we're not ignoring that. It's just an earlier part of the process if needed.
There's another question here, actually. Graham Ross, who's well known to us here. Root causes prevent resolution, so surely that is a benefit to Infinity to enable the parties to find a solution notwithstanding. Then again, an issue to help reduce root causes can be added to a settlement, for example, removing an adverse review. So if the root cause of the problem has been sort of an adverse review, they could ask people to remove that. So yeah, thanks, Graham. That's sort of a little bit of a counter maybe to Richard in some ways, but Infinity can be used right across the board. Ernie's point just earlier about how important building the single negotiating framework is a good point. And the essence of that is, if it's done not just as a modeler, but if a number of, or even if it's just two, maybe three parties want to do it together, when they sit around the table, there's far less opportunity for adversarial behavior to be beneficial. So it's not in the interest of the parties to get into that sort of adversarial, sort of emotional side, because you're not actually deciding on a number or on what the solution will be. You're really just deciding on what options there are that at the end of the day, your particular side, for lack of a better way of putting it, will settle for, will be happy with. And then just how important that is. I have to raise an issue. When I was first involved with this more than 5 years ago now, when we were talking about this, and I mentioned about getting everything in order and having all the issues sorted out and having the relative importance of one issue to the other. And I sort of made obviously some comment to Ernie along the lines of, do you really have to do that? And in his point was quite indignant and said, well, if you can't do that, you shouldn't be negotiating at all. Which means, get really to what this process does is really makes the negotiator work harder. And, unfortunately, in some ways, I've got experience in international negotiations whereby on far too many occasions, people came out from airports and from around the world and sat around the breakfast table. And to be brutally honest, some of the leaders of delegations, that was the first time they really began to think seriously about what was going to happen 1 hour's time in a plenary or in another meeting, which is not great. And so, this is actually giving a process where people can go through. And if I was a senior deputy minister in a government, and I'd given this to people to do 3 months ago, and I had a position set out in the format that we do here with Infinity, I could take that last position and very quickly take myself back into what we were thinking, what we were doing, what the issues were. I can say that this has changed. And something that wasn't brought out today is that you can add an issue, change a preference. Any party can add an issue, change a preference, do anything right up to the baseline agreement. So this isn't, when you start at the actual process, you're not locked in. If you have like most negotiations, you have a brainwave at the wrong time towards the end, you can actually feed that in and it will make the relative adjustments. And show the difference between the purple with the ones with satisfaction and the ones in with just the normal text and the font with the black.
Okay, so which one?
Let's do the upgrade of the dike then. It's just that's good.
Okay, so you saw that phase 1 cost was represented with a line graph because that's a numerical issue. But upgrading dike C is represented with a bar graph because the options here are, it's an optioned issue. So there are various options available for the solution. And if realign in phase 2 was better for you, you can just pull that up. And if existing route is worse, you can just pull that down. And of course, you can fine tune these as you go along as well. Peter made a really good point, is that the model itself, you fine tune it as you go along. You start with the basics and then you just keep building. So it's not difficult. This scenario itself is quite complex, but it started with just those first 3 parties and those first issues, and it was built on by there. So I'm going to say no to saving those changes. These issues here in black don't have a number attached to them. Well, that does not mean that they're not important. It means that they are represented within these issues because of the constraints that are working behind the scenes. So the importances of these funding issues are included within the preferences of the issues in purple.
We're at the top of the hour now, and I'm just going to wind this up, and thank you everybody for attending and all of your insightful questions. They were great, and we just love to hear from you. What do you think of what we've shown you? And it's a lot to take in a short time, and we'll be interacting with you as you get back to us by email. So it's info@smartsettle.com, and we'll be in touch with you shortly. So thank you very much. Bye for now.